There comes a moment, sometimes in the stillness of a sleepless night, sometimes in the echo of a breaking heart, when a silent cry rises from within the soul. Why must I suffer? It is not a question of intellect. It is not born from idle curiosity. It is the voice of life itself, echoing through the chambers of human experience. It is the whisper that haunts those who have lost, those who have failed, those who have loved deeply only to be left with silence. It is the question that we carry in our bones long before we ever speak it aloud. The child who trembles in fear, the mother who buries her son, the old man who watches his body betray him, all ask it in some way. Why does pain exist in a universe created by a loving God? This question is not new. It has burned through every age, scarring scrolls, scriptures, and philosophies. From the Lamentations of Job to the Meditations of the Buddha, from the dialogues of Plato to the sorrows of Christ, this inquiry has danced with fire through the corridors of human consciousness. And yet, no answer can ever be complete, for pain is not a concept to be solved. It is an experience to be transfigured. Perhaps that is the beginning of wisdom, to understand that suffering is not merely to be escaped, but to be understood, embraced, and ultimately alchemized. We live in a world bound by time and space, shaped by choices, fragmented by fear. Ours is a planet that, according to the revelations of the Urantia Book, has walked the lonely path of quarantine, abandoned in part by the rebellion of celestial beings who broke the harmony of divine governance. We are the children of that fracture, born into a realm where spiritual gravity has been disturbed, where love must grow against resistance, and where suffering has become both symptom and teacher. But suffering is not merely punishment. It is not chaos without purpose. It is not cruelty without design. Hidden beneath its darkness is a language, a sacred code written in silence and shadows. And to those who learn to read it, suffering becomes something else entirely. It becomes the threshold of awakening. Across the pages of this journey, we will walk through the many chambers of pain, its origin in the cosmos, its architecture in the mind, its trials through freedom and failure, its transformation through love and mysticism. We will sit with sages and wander with prophets. We will look through the eyes of Jesus, not only as Savior, but as one who tasted every drop of human sorrow and wore it like a crown. We will listen to the voices of mystics who kissed the flame, of philosophers who wrestled with meaning, of psychologists who mapped the shadow. But more than that, we will look inward, for it is within the sanctuary of your own soul that the deepest revelations will unfold. This is not a book to be studied. It is a mirror to be entered. And if you dare to pass through its still surface, you may find that the pain which once broke you was, in truth, the hand of God shaping you for something more than survival, for union, for truth, for eternity. This is not a promise of easy answers. It is an invitation to a deeper question. And if you're ready, truly ready, let us begin. The ache begins not in the flesh, but in the quiet places where words dissolve. It is older than memory and deeper than thought. It is the ache of being, the tension between what we are and what we sense we ought to be. Before we speak, we cry. Before we understand, we feel. And somewhere in that feeling, in that silent mourning of the soul for something it cannot name, the question is born. Why do we suffer? The first humans, standing under a canopy of stars, must have looked up and wondered why beauty was so often paired with grief. Why the sun rose only to set. Why birth was followed by loss. Why love ended in death. It is not merely an intellectual puzzle. It is a wound at the root of consciousness itself. This is the question that does not fade with time. It does not shrink in the presence of science. It does not dissolve with the comforts of progress. Instead, it lingers, echoing softly beneath every joy, every triumph, every silent night. Blaise Pascal, the philosopher-poet of paradox, once said that man is but a reed, the most fragile thing in nature, yet he is a thinking reed. His greatness lies not in strength, but in his ability to suffer consciously, to ask questions no animal dares to ponder. And what greater question exists than the meaning of pain? Ecclesiastes called it vanity, a chasing after the wind, a world where everything has its season, birth, death, war, peace, weeping, laughter, but none of it remains. Time, the great devourer, makes dust of all we cherish. And so we wonder, what's the point? Why dream if all dreams are swallowed by night? Why love if loss is its shadow? Yet even in the despair of that ancient text, there is a sacred invitation to seek something beyond the flux, beyond the cycles. To look for meaning not in the avoidance of pain, but through it. The Book of Job is not a tale of resolution, but of revolution. The spiritual upheaval of a man crushed by the weight of incomprehensible suffering. Job asks what every wounded heart has asked. What have I done to deserve this? And when no answer satisfies, when theology and reason fail him, Job does not curse God. He wrestles. He demands to be seen. And in the silence that follows, he is. That is the power of the question. Not to erase the pain, but to open a door into presence, into divine encounter. Viktor Frankl, speaking from the ashes of Auschwitz, would later echo the same truth, that man's greatest freedom is to choose his response to suffering. That meaning is not something we find. It is something we forge in the furnace of affliction. Pain, in this view, is not the end of meaning, but its birthplace. In the Urantia Papers, we are told that even the greatest of spiritual beings are not exempt from trial. That Jesus himself, Michael of Nebadon, walked the path of agony not to avoid suffering, but to sanctify it. He did not come to take away all pain, but to illuminate it from within, to show that in the hands of the divine, even sorrow becomes sacred. This, perhaps, is the first answer to our question, not a solution, but a shift in vision. To suffer is not to be abandoned. To suffer is to be awakened. And what we awaken to may be the very thing we've been seeking all along. And still, the question remains, not because we haven't answered it, but because it is a living question, one that matures as we do. Perhaps it is not meant to be solved like a riddle, but lived like a sacred path, as if suffering were not a wall to be broken down, but a veil to be parted. We are born into a world where pain exists not only in the body, but in the spirit, where wounds are not always visible, but just as real, where the soul carries memories from 1,000 moments of silence, longing, and ache. And in this mysterious field of experience, the human spirit stretches out, vulnerable, questioning, searching. To suffer is to be aware of contrast, the contrast between what is and what could be, between the ideal and the real, between heaven and earth. Suffering reveals our capacity to imagine the infinite while confined to the finite. It is the tension between our mortal limitations and the echoes of an immortal origin. We bleed because we remember a state in which we did not bleed. We ache because something within us knows that wholeness once was, or still could be. In the view of the Urantia Book, suffering is not proof of divine neglect, but of the profound dignity of free will. We are not puppets. We are not prisoners. We are evolutionary beings, destined to grow, to choose, to become. And in that sacred freedom lies both our nobility and our sorrow. If the Father were to prevent every pain, every loss, every failure, he would also be preventing our growth. He would be stealing from us the very struggle that forges soul, that awakens the deeper layers of love and truth. The universe, according to this revelation, is not a cold machine, but a living organism, one in which even error, rebellion, and sorrow are permitted. Not because they are good in themselves, but because they are ingredients in the greater unfolding of eternal good. What seems cruel from the ground looks purposeful from the sky. And so we are not abandoned. We are entrusted. This idea turns the world upside down. It suggests that God does not rescue us from every sorrow because he trusts us with sorrow. That pain is not a punishment for being broken. It is a testimony that we are becoming whole, that our tears are not signs of divine absence, but of divine presence in process. Viktor Frankl, who endured the concentration camps, spoke not of how to escape suffering, but how to redeem it. He found meaning even there, where meaning seemed most impossible, because meaning is not given. It is made, carved in a time by the courage to keep asking, keep seeking, keep loving, even when all reason tells you not to. And what a job! That trembling figure in the ash heap of the world, he, too, teaches us something radical, that is not blasphemous to question God. It is human, and more, it is holy. For the cry of the sufferer is the beginning of intimacy. God does not punish Job for his anger. He answers him. The answer, as recorded in the ancient text, is not a formula or a fix. It is a whirlwind, a glimpse of vastness, a revelation of perspective. Job is not told why he suffers. He is shown who is with him in the storm, and that perhaps is the beginning of peace. And still, the soul leans forward, somewhere beyond theology and theory, beyond doctrines and defenses. There is a quiet knowing, a whisper beneath the noise of our reasoning. It speaks not in sentences, but in sensation, in the aching when we see injustice, in the breathlessness that comes with beauty, in the sacred pause after loss, when everything falls silent and the soul looks up. It is then we remember that we are not only bodies, not only minds. We are beings of soul, and the soul is not merely a passenger in this world. It is the question itself. To suffer is to be marked by longing, and to long is to love what has not yet been made whole. Pain, then, is the shadow of love in a world not yet complete. It is the evidence that we were made for something more. And what if that more is not a place, not a time, but a becoming? The preacher of Ecclesiastes, wearied by the cycles of life, declared all things vanity. Yet even in his despair, he did not stop asking. He kept observing, kept recording. He did not silence the question, he gave it voice. And that voice now echoes in the sacred texts of billions. Not because it offered answers, but because it dignified the question. The same could be said of every honest seeker, every soul that has refused to look away from suffering's face. Perhaps the greatest act of faith is not to believe blindly in divine goodness, but to believe while asking within the pain, through the absence. We are not called to deny suffering, nor to glorify it. We are called to walk with it, to ask it what it wants to teach us. And in that walking, something unexpected happens. The question begins to open us. It softens our judgments, stretches our hearts, deepens our presence. We begin to see others, truly see them, not as problems to be solved, but as mysteries to be loved. And that, perhaps, is the quiet gift of suffering. It breaks the shell around the soul so that love can breathe again. In the view of the Urantia Book, this is the path of ascending beings, not to live without pain, but to grow through it into wisdom, into beauty, into spiritual maturity. And so we begin not with answers, but with attention. Not with escape, but with encounter. To ask why do we suffer is not a weakness. It is the most human and perhaps the most divine thing we can do. For in that question, a journey begins. Not away from pain, but through it. Not into darkness, but toward a light that pain cannot extinguish. And so, let us keep asking. Let us walk into the ache with eyes open. Let us follow the path the question reveals. For the question itself may be the door. And beyond it, a love larger than all sorrow, waiting in silence with arms wide open. Before the first tear was shed on earth, before the cry of any infant pierced the stillness of a mortal night, there was already a dissonance stirring in the fabric of the cosmos. To understand suffering, we must go back, not only to the beginning of history, but to the womb of existence itself. Pain did not originate in a single wound, nor was it born in a battlefield or a broken home. It emerged, instead, at the very edge of light, at the fragile boundary between the eternal and the temporal, where infinity made space for finitude, and unity gave way to multiplicity. Creation itself is an act of separation. For anything to exist apart from the all must step back. In the mysticism of the Kabbalah, this is the tzimtzum, the sacred contraction of God to allow a space where something other than God might arise. But in that space, absence was born. And with absence, longing. And with longing, the ache we would later call suffering. From the fullness of divine oneness, vessels were formed to hold the light. But some vessels cracked under the glory, and the light spilled, fragmented, scattered across dimensions, encoded in stars and souls. These are the broken kalim, the shattered containers of divine presence. And we, in many ways, are the wanderers tasked with gathering the pieces, with remembering the whole. This fracture is echoed across spiritual traditions. In Plato's Timaeus, where the world we inhabit is but a shadow of the perfect realm, a reflection dimmed by distance from its source. In a Gnostic myth of Sophia, where wisdom falls from the pleroma, the fullness, in a yearning to know something apart from the divine, and in so doing, births a world of illusion and entropy. It is the story of a descent, not into evil, but into limitation. And from limitation arises suffering. Even in the luminous revelation of the Urantia Book, we find that pain did not simply emerge from human folly or chance, but from a cosmic defiance. The rebellion of Lucifer, a high spiritual being, was not an act of hatred, but of pride cloaked in false freedom. He sought autonomy not rooted in divine relationship, but in self-assertion. Caligastia, the planetary prince assigned to guide this world, aligned with this rebellion. And thus our world, once intended to be a thriving garden of evolutionary light, became an orphaned planet, spiritually quarantined, cut off from the circuits of celestial communication, isolated in the long night of confusion. We suffer, in part, because we are born into that fracture, not as punishment, but as participants in a cosmic story still unfolding. Our pain is not just biological, it is existential. It is the echo of an ancient rupture we have inherited, in which we are invited to help heal. In Hermetic thought, this world is a plane of duality, of opposition and illusion. The material veil obscures the unity behind all things. We experience separation not only from others, but from ourselves and ultimately from the source. This illusion of separateness gives rise to fear. Fear becomes the root of desire, and desire, when unfulfilled or misdirected, becomes the cradle of suffering. But none of this means the world is evil, only that it is unfinished. Time is not the enemy. It is the medium through which healing unfolds. The very structure of this universe, with its constraints, its shadows, its losses, is not a flaw, but a stage. The divine did not abandon us to this stage. The divine became one of us, not to escape it, but to walk through it with us, to remind us that even in the dust of limitation, the breath of eternity can still be felt. We are not in exile because we are cursed. We are in exile because we are becoming. And the suffering that touches us is the consequence not of malevolence, but of the immense, sacred risk that love takes when it gives freedom to creation. And so, from the vastness of divine stillness, the universe was born, not perfect but dynamic, not static but alive. And in that life, something essential was seeded. The potential to err, to diverge, to fall, but also the potential to rise, to remember, to return. Creation was not a single act, but an unfolding. In this unfolding, each plane of existence echoed the same paradox. Beauty wrapped in fragility, light entangled with shadow, order flirting with chaos. What we now call suffering was not originally a flaw in the design, but a byproduct of the design's freedom. Without the possibility of fragmentation, there could be no true union. Without separation, there could be no longing. And without longing, love would never learn to endure. Lucifer's rebellion, as described in the Urantia Book, was not the birth of evil, but the assertion of autonomy outside divine harmony. It was the cry of a being who mistook independence for supremacy, and in doing so, introduced a kind of spiritual dissonance into the cosmic symphony. When Caligastia joined this rebellion, our world, which had been entrusted to him as a planetary prince, lost its compass. It was not just a betrayal, it was a distortion of divine intention. This is how suffering descended from the metaphysical into the planetary, from the celestial into the human. We were left not abandoned, but adrift, still held by the gravity of divine love, but unable to feel its pull with clarity. A kind of fog settled over the collective soul of humanity. And within this fog, the illusion of separateness thickened. The Hermetic tradition teaches that all is one, as above, so below, but it also acknowledges the veil that clouds that unity. We are, in this perspective, divine sparks clothed in matter, souls asleep to their origin, living in a dream that feels all too real. The pain we endure arises from mistaking the dream for the truth, the form for the essence. It is the ache of forgetting. In Gnostic thought, this forgetting takes the form of a divine tragedy. Sophia, the embodiment of wisdom, descends at her yearning to know, and in her fall births the material world, a realm of distance from the true light. Here, suffering is not simply physical pain, but the metaphysical dislocation of the soul, the confusion of identity, the severance from source. But even this myth does not end in despair, for the light remains embedded in all things, hidden but intact, waiting to be awakened. Plato saw the world as a pale reflection, a copy of a perfect realm beyond time. In his Timaeus, the universe is a living creature, shaped by a divine craftsman, but made from imperfect materials. Thus, disorder persists, not as a condemnation, but as an inevitable consequence of building beauty in a medium that resists perfection. The suffering we know is the vibration of that resistance. It is the tremble between the eternal design and the temporal materials. But this resistance is not meaningless. It is the very thing that allows growth, transformation, movement. It is what turns beings into souls and souls into light. This, perhaps, is the paradox of all true metaphysics. That pain is not the opposite of love, but the weight of love in a world not yet whole. that the universe, in giving itself to multiplicity, accepted the risk of sorrow, and that this sorrow is, in some incomprehensible way, part of the journey back to union. We suffer because we are in process, because God did not build puppets, but gave breath to creatures who could choose, fall, rise, and evolve. Because to become conscious is to become vulnerable, and because to love deeply is to risk being wounded. But if this is true, if suffering is the shadow cast by freedom, then every ache is also a signpost. Every sorrow is a compass. Every separation is a path waiting to be walked home. And if all of this, the cosmic contraction, the fall of light, the planetary quarantine, the veil of illusion, has brought us to a world where suffering is woven into the fabric of time and flesh, then the question is no longer only why do we suffer, but what do we do with it? For if the world is imperfect by design, if creation is incomplete by necessity, then our role is not merely to endure, but to participate. We are not victims of a divine flaw, nor subjects of a cruel game. We are co-creators of an unfinished masterpiece. The pain we feel is not a punishment, but a pressure, the same kind of pressure that turns coal into diamond, that drives stars to ignite, that teaches spirit to remember itself in matter. Time, then, is not a curse, but a crucible. It is within time that we learn the lessons of limitation, that we grow intimate with imperfection. We learn to let go, to love in loss, to hope without guarantee. We learn the art of surrender, not as defeat, but as transcendence. And slowly, through the winding corridors of experience, the soul begins to awaken. Every tradition, in its own language, has whispered this truth, that beneath the veil of suffering, something luminous waits. In the broken vessel, the scattered sparks of the divine still shimmer. In the fallen world, beauty still breathes. In the shadow, the outline of the source can still be traced. In the silence after rebellion, there is still a voice. And perhaps the greatest secret hidden within all this complexity is that we are not only the ones who suffer the consequences of cosmic rupture. We are also the ones called to restore what has been torn. We are healers of the breach, bridge builders across dimensions, not merely pilgrims walking a lonely path, but cells of consciousness through which the universe remembers itself. What was fragmented through choice can be restored through love. What was scattered through pride can be gathered through humility. What was darkened by illusion can be illumined by the willingness to see. The teachings of ancient mystics, of celestial revelators, of philosophers and prophets, all converge here. Suffering is the mark of our distance from the center, and a map back to it. The wound is both exile and invitation. And what we call the human condition is not the end of the story, but the middle, the turning point where pain becomes prayer, where confusion becomes wisdom, and where the broken world begins, ever so slowly, to remember its source. As we step forward into the next chamber of this exploration, we will leave behind the stars and return to the soul. For though suffering was born in time and space, it takes root in the mind, and the mind, too, holds keys to liberation. If the cosmos gave birth to suffering through the fracture of unity, it is within the mind that suffering takes shape, colored, magnified, denied, or transformed. The universe may have cracked in the silence of eternity, but it is in the intimacy of our inner world that the echo becomes a scream. The mind is not merely a collection of thoughts. It is a temple, a battlefield, a mirror. Within it, entire landscapes are formed, sometimes luminous, sometimes haunted. It is the space where meaning is made, where memory takes root, where identity is sculpted and shattered and sculpted again. And it is within this sacred architecture that pain finds its voice. The Buddha, in his Four Noble Truths, saw clearly the structure of suffering. That life contains pain. That pain is intensified by attachment and craving. That freedom is possible through the cessation of desire, and that there is a path toward that freedom. Yet this path is not outside us. It winds through the mind, through the corridors of perception and the tangled forests of emotion. Suffering arises not only from what happens, but from how we hold what happens. The ego, that fragile scaffolding of identity, is both shield and prison. It protects us from disintegration, but it also traps us in illusion. The illusion that we are separate, that we are alone, that we must defend, compare, compete. It feeds on fear and grows through repetition. It clings to what has hurt us, not because it wants to suffer, but because it believes that pain defines us. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny, repress, or reject. In the darkness of the unconscious, these unacknowledged fragments stir. They leak into dreams, into projections, into silent self-sabotage. When suffering is not faced, it does not disappear. It disguises itself. It returns in new forms, in anxiety, addiction, numbness, rage. To walk the path of individuation, as Jung proposed, is to bring light to those inner shadows. To listen, not with judgment, but with presence. To understand that what we fear in ourselves is often the very place where our healing waits. Pain is not always the enemy. Sometimes it is the alarm that something true has been buried, that something sacred is asking to rise. Freud, less mystical but no less piercing, saw how the mind erects defenses to protect itself. Repression, denial, displacement, strategies of survival. And yet, over time, these defenses can become prisons. We begin to live within narrowed corridors, unable to feel deeply, unable to trust, constantly scanning for danger, even in peace. The very mechanisms that once shielded us become the architects of our ongoing suffering. Augusto Curry, a modern voice in the symphony of psychological insight, speaks of the accelerated mind, a mind bombarded by stimuli, expectations, comparisons. We no longer suffer only from what happens to us, but from what we anticipate, imagine, and replay. Our suffering becomes recursive, a loop of thought, a storm without end. The mind, once a sanctuary, becomes a cage. But there is a deeper truth beneath this architecture, a silence beneath the storm, that we are not the pain we carry. We are not the voice of fear. We are not the looping thought, the ancient wound, the inherited script. Beneath all of it, there is a presence still clear, undamaged, a space untouched by trauma, waiting patiently behind every breakdown, whispering not of control, but of surrender. Joseph Campbell traced this path through myth. The hero does not avoid the underworld, he descends. He faces the dragon not to destroy it, but to retrieve something lost. The suffering is not the end, it is the passage. And on the other side, not perfection but integration. The architecture of the mind is not meant to be demolished, but transformed. The walls once built for defense can become doors. The inner divisions can become bridges. The voices once filled with fear can learn a new language, the language of compassion. And so the question is not merely how do we escape pain, but how do we relate to it? What stories do we tell ourselves? What parts of us have never been heard? What longing hides beneath the ache? To walk this path is to become the architect of a new mind, not one without shadows, but one where light is no longer feared. Not one without wounds, but one where wounds become windows. a mind that no longer resists suffering, but listens to it, and in listening finds the seed of its own liberation. And yet, there is resistance. The mind, conditioned by years of survival, by inherited patterns and ancestral grief, does not easily release its defenses. To suffer has become familiar. For some, it even becomes identity. And so healing is not only about releasing pain, it is about facing the fear of who we are without it. The accelerated mind, as Augusto Curry describes, does not pause to breathe. It races from past regret to future worry, from comparison to inadequacy, from perfectionism to paralysis. It feeds on speed, but starves for stillness. This restless state is not merely inconvenient, it is toxic. It disables our capacity for presence. It leaves us mentally exhausted, emotionally numb, spiritually disconnected. And this disconnection amplifies suffering, turning passing pain into permanent imprint. But the mind is not a machine. It is a garden. What grows in it depends on what is planted and what is left untended. If we only feed it fear, it will yield anxiety. If we water it with silence, it may begin to bloom clarity. If we greet our thoughts as visitors rather than masters, we may discover we are not at their mercy. The mind, like the soul, longs to return to center. It is not our enemy. It is our companion, waiting to be seen, restructured, loved. Jung reminds us that healing does not mean the absence of conflict, but the reconciliation of opposites. That wholeness does not require perfection, but integration. The shadow does not disappear because we pretend it doesn't exist. It disappears when we sit beside it, ask it what it needs, and listen without flinching. Suffering becomes sacred when it opens the door to self-knowledge, when it becomes the fire that burns away illusion and reveals the face behind the mask. In dreams, archetypes arise, ancient symbols from the collective unconscious. The warrior, the child, the sage, the mother. Each carries a message. Each holds a fragment of us. Suffering is often the signal that one of these voices has been silenced too long, buried beneath the roles we perform or the expectations we carry. To suffer is to be summoned by the forgotten self, the self that longs not to be fixed, but to be felt. Campbell's hero does not slay the dragon by avoiding fear, but by entering its cave. And what he finds there is rarely what he expects. Sometimes the treasure is not gold, but grief. Not certainty, but surrender. The journey is inward. The monster is often our own pain, made grotesque by years of avoidance. But when faced, it shrinks, it speaks, and then it softens. And the Buddha, calm beneath his Bodhi tree, saw the wheel of becoming. How suffering continues not because of pain itself, but because of clinging. We cling to who we think we should be. We cling to outcomes, to narratives, to control. We resist impermanence, though impermanence is the only constant. And in that resistance, we create friction. And in that friction, we suffer. But the way out is not escape, it is awakening. To suffer is to be invited, to listen, to see, to awaken not only to the pain, but to the self who witnesses the pain without being consumed by it. The self that is not thought, not memory, not fear. The self that watches, waits, and knows. And so we return to the mind, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a sacred space to be reordered, where wounds are not erased, but honored, where patterns are not condemned, but rewired, where thoughts are not dictators, but teachers, and where suffering is no longer a prison, but a passage. The soul, having walked through this inner architecture, emerges not unbroken, but unburdened, ready to meet the next question, not only with insight, but with presence, For suffering does not end in the mind. It begins to shift there and leads us towards something even more profound. For what we think is often shaped by what we believe, and what we believe is shaped by what we search for. And now, we are ready to search for meaning not only within, but beyond. There are places within the soul that resemble deserts, vast, wind-swept landscapes where old beliefs wither and easy answers evaporate beneath the heat of suffering. It is in such terrain that philosophers have always wandered, not to escape pain, but to interrogate it, not to silence the ache, but to sit with it long enough that it might begin to speak. Philosophy, at its deepest, is not born in comfort. It is born in crisis. It arises not when life is simple, but when life becomes unbearable. It begins with the disorientation of pain, and from there dares to ask, if life hurts, does it still matter? If meaning fades, can it be rebuilt? If suffering is certain, how then shall we live? Socrates, wandering the streets of Athens, declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. His wisdom was not a refuge from discomfort, but a confrontation with it. For him, suffering was not merely physical or emotional. It was the suffering of ignorance, the anguish of not knowing oneself. He understood that to live without questioning was to exist in shadows. His life and his death became a testament to the dignity of asking the right questions, even when the answers were elusive or costly. Epictetus, once a slave, taught that while we cannot control what happens, we can control our response. Suffering, in the Stoic vision, is not what breaks us. It is what builds us when met with inner discipline. The Stoics did not deny pain. They transcended its tyranny. In fire and misfortune, they saw a forge for the soul. Seneca, facing exile and the eventual order to take his own life, still wrote of virtue, of inner strength, of peace found not in the absence of trial, but in the constancy of character. Their wisdom is not naive, it is weathered. It knows the storms and chooses to stand still. But not all philosophers offered serenity. Some gazed deeper into the abyss. Arthur Schopenhauer saw suffering as the core of existence itself, not as accident, but as essence. To live was to desire, and to desire was to lack, and to lack was to suffer. His was a philosophy of resignation, tinged with darkness, yet startlingly honest. He did not offer hope, but in his bleak clarity, many found a strange kind of relief. A mirror unclouded, a voice that named what others feared to admit. Friedrich Nietzsche, the defiant poet of pain, did not flinch from sorrow. He made of it a furnace. Amor fati, the love of one's fate, became his cry. Not to endure pain begrudgingly, but to embrace it as necessary, even sacred. He saw in suffering the seed of greatness. The wound, for him, was not only a scar, it was a birthmark of potential. Out of suffering, the strong emerge. Out of chaos, stars are born. And though he too would descend into madness, his words still rise like a flame. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. Albert Camus, standing in the shadow of war and existential silence, called suffering absurd, not because it lacked pain, but because it lacked clarity. The world, he said, does not explain itself. It simply is, and in that absence of reason, we are tempted toward despair. But Camus, paradoxically, chose revolt. Not rebellion against life, but rebellion against meaninglessness. If the world gives us no meaning, then we create it. Not as illusion, but as defiance, as art, as choice. In the face of absurdity, he did not surrender. He smiled. He picked up the stone again and again. And in that gesture, meaning was reborn. These philosophers did not agree on the nature of suffering, but they shared a reverence for its power. They understood that pain is not the end of thought, it is its beginning. That in the barren deserts of the soul, the seeds of wisdom are planted, not because we find answers, but because we learn to live without needing all the answers. Suffering breaks the surface. Philosophy digs deeper. The desert, though vast and silent, is not empty. It is in that very stillness that the mind begins to listen, not for rescue, but for truth. What these philosophers discovered in their different ways is that suffering demands something from us that comfort never will. It strips us bare, then invites us to rebuild. Not the same, but deeper, more conscious, more awake. To suffer and think is not to escape pain, but to dignify it. Philosophy becomes a kind of sacred rebellion, the act of standing upright in a world that bends toward indifference. To think is to resist the flattening of the soul, to say, I will not suffer blindly. I will look at this pain until it becomes something more than torment. I will wrestle with the silence until it reveals its secret. Even in moments when thought cannot resolve what aches, it still holds space for reverence. The question itself becomes a kind of prayer, not always toward a God who answers, but toward a truth that unfolds in layers across lifetimes. Suffering, then, is not always a question that demands clarity. Sometimes it is a presence that demands companionship. And so the desert does not defeat the philosopher. It refines him. It removes the unnecessary, humbles the certainty, softens the ego. It asks, what can you still hold when everything else has been taken? What remains when the reasons are gone? What shines when all else fails to reflect? Perhaps this is why so many of these thinkers wrote not from palaces but from prisons, literal or existential. Seneca, surrounded by political intrigue and betrayal. Epictetus, born into chains. Socrates, condemned by the very democracy he served. Nietzsche, writing through illness and exile. Camus, facing the wreckage of war and the silence of the divine. They did not avoid suffering. They did not transcend it with blind hope. They allowed it to sharpen their minds, to deepen their hearts, to elevate their words. Each one, in their own way, became a witness, not to a world without pain, but to a life that can still burn with meaning in the midst of it. They show us that the question is not, can I escape this? But can I stay awake inside it? Can I learn to hold the tension between what is and what should be, between love and loss, between absurdity and beauty, without collapsing into despair? The answer, if it exists, is not a doctrine. It is a choice, a daily, trembling choice to create meaning where none is given, to love even when love might end, to speak even when the silence is louder, to rise again and again into the weight of being. In this sense, suffering becomes a rite of passage, not into cynicism, but into depth, not into nihilism, but into authenticity. And in that authenticity, something glows. Not certainty, but presence. Not answers, but awareness. Not escape, but courage. From here, the journey must continue. For while pain may fuel thought, it is choice that gives thought its direction. What we believe is shaped not only by what we suffer, but by how we respond to that suffering. And in that response lies the next unfolding of our path. If suffering awakens the soul and thought refines it, then freedom tests it. For there is no burden so subtle and sacred as choice. No gift so radiant and so dangerous. No force so capable of shaping destinies, both luminous and tragic. To be free is not merely to move without restraint. It is to stand before the infinite field of possibility and choose again and again. knowing that each act echoes into eternity, that every decision builds or breaks the world we inhabit. And to be conscious of that is to tremble with the weight of responsibility. The Urantia Book speaks of free will not as a byproduct of intelligence, but as the divine fingerprint upon the soul. It is what makes us co-creators. It is what makes growth authentic, but it is also what opens the door to sorrow. Evolution, in this vision, requires experience, and experience demands freedom. Freedom to err, to defy, to love imperfectly. Without that freedom, there is no soul formation. There is only automation. But with it, there is risk, and from that risk, pain. This is the paradox at the heart of human tragedy, that much of what wounds us is born not from fate, but from freedom, ours and others. We are not simply victims of an external world, but participants in a collective unfolding of will and consequence. The tragedies that shake us often arise from decisions, taken or avoided, by beings just as confused and complex as we are. St. Augustine, struggling to reconcile the existence of evil with the goodness of God, proposed that evil is not a created thing, but the absence of good, a shadow cast when love is withheld, when alignment is lost. In this light, suffering emerges not from divine intention, but from human deviation. When the will turns away from the source, a vacuum forms. Into that emptiness, distortion floods. Jean-Paul Sartre, speaking not from theology, but from existential urgency, took freedom even further, declaring that we are condemned to be free, that we are thrust into a world without preset meaning, and that every choice we make defines not only our lives, but ourselves. In this view, suffering comes not just from external failure, but from the unbearable responsibility of creating meaning in the void. We are authors of our own stories, but the pen burns in our hands. The fall of man, as told through the lens of Christian theology, is not a tale of apple and serpent alone. It is a mythic echo of this same dilemma. The choice to know, to deviate, to experiment with autonomy is the birth of self-awareness, and with it, the rupture. Temptation, then, is not simply the whisper of evil, but the challenge of discernment. And the consequences are not punishments, but the natural gravity of decision. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna stands on a battlefield of inner and outer conflict, paralyzed by the terror of action. Krishna does not remove his dilemma. He illuminates it. He teaches that right action, or dharma, is not about personal comfort, but universal harmony. That choice is not merely about preference, but alignment. One must act, but one must act with consciousness, without attachment to outcome, with devotion to truth. Thus, freedom is never isolated. It is woven into a tapestry of ethics, of consequences, of unseen ripples. We are free, but not from cause and effect. We are free, but not from the sacred tension between self and other, between impulse and principle. Pain arises when the will forgets its place within the whole, when it acts without awareness, without compassion, without context. And sometimes, pain arises not from malicious intent, but from honest ignorance. We choose with incomplete maps. We hurt each other not because we wish to, but because we do not yet see clearly. And still we must choose. This is the burden and the brilliance of existence, that every soul is a node of divine possibility, a center of volition, capable of shaping the future by how it responds to the present. We do not choose the conditions into which we are born, the body, the century, the family, the wounds we inherit. But from the moment consciousness awakens, we are faced with a sacred question. What will you do with what has been placed in your hands? And in that question, we're made sovereign, not over the world, but over ourselves. Free will is not the guarantee of comfort. It is the invitation to become. It asks us to live with open eyes, to see the web of our impact, to move with reverence through a world where every thought, every word, every act ripples outward like light on water. And when we do not move with reverence, when we act in blindness, in fear, in pride, suffering follows. But not as revenge, not as divine punishment. Suffering becomes the mirror, the echo, the result. The soul, as envisioned in the Urantia Book, evolves through this dance of action and reaction, not in a linear ascent, but in a spiraling journey where growth comes from experience, and experience is shaped by will. Even the celestial beings who fell, Lucifer, Caligastia, did so not by accident, but by choice. And their fall, though tragic, became part of a larger unfolding. For in a universe governed by love, even mistakes are not wasted. They become contrast. They become context. They become the darkness against which light is more clearly seen. This is the hidden mercy in the law of choice, that even when we fall, we are never fixed in failure. The next choice still awaits. The next moment is unwritten, and so redemption is always possible, not as erasure of the past, but as transformation of the present. We are never condemned by our freedom. We are invited again and again to remember it, to wield it wisely, to use it not as a weapon, but as a tool of healing, to align our will with something greater than our fear, with truth, with beauty, with God. The Bhagavad Gita reminds us that clarity comes not in avoiding choice, but in purifying it. Right action is not perfect action. It is conscious action. When we release attachment to reward or fear of outcome, we enter into the flow of Dharma, the rhythm of being aligned with our deepest integrity. And from that place, even suffering shifts. It no longer owns us. It shapes us. This, then, is the hidden paradox of free will. It causes suffering, but also ends it. It brings harm, but it also brings healing. It is the flame that can burn or illuminate, depending on how it is held. And perhaps this is why the Creator grants it so freely. Not because we will always use it well, but because without it, we could never truly become. We are not simply here to be protected. We are here to choose. And in the choosing, we begin to taste the mystery of love, not as something given, but as something chosen in return. As we step forward into the next chamber of this journey, we will move beyond the tragedy of choice into the possibility of purpose, to ask not only why do we suffer, but what might it teach us? If suffering refines the soul, then perhaps affliction itself is part of the sacred curriculum, not to punish, but to awaken. If freedom is the threshold of experience, then suffering is its classroom. Not the kind built of walls and chalk, but one carved in silence, fire, and time. A hidden school where no lesson comes without a cost, and every cost conceals a greater gift. There is a curriculum written not in ink, but in the fibers of existence itself. We are born into it not by punishment, but by promise. A soul does not enter matter to escape struggle. It enters to grow, to remember, to become. And in this becoming, affliction is not the enemy. It is the sculptor's hand. The Urantia Book speaks of mortal life as a crucible of ascension, a theater where evolutionary beings are refined through experience, tested not by cruelty, but by challenge, by uncertainty, by the friction between limitation and longing. In this vision, suffering is not arbitrary. It is pedagogical. Not all pain is chosen, but all pain contains the potential to awaken. It is not the wound alone that matters, but the soul's response. Pain interrupts. It dismantles our illusions of control. It brings us to our knees, not to break us, but to position us closer to the truth, closer to humility, closer to God. The soul, which sleeps in comfort, often stirs in discomfort. And what feels like devastation is sometimes the beginning of clarity. Teilhard de Chardin saw the soul not as static, but as a force in motion, a being in the process of divinization. For him, evolution was not limited to biology, but extended into the spirit. Every sorrow, every trial, every dark night was part of a deeper convergence, drawing us toward the omega point, the divine union that waits not above us, but within us, unfolding from seed to star. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings becoming conscious through human experience. And suffering, in this context, becomes a sacred accelerant. The mystics knew this well. St. John of the Cross wrote of the noche oscura, the dark night of the soul, not as abandonment, but as passage, a time when the soul is stripped of all consolation, all light, all certainty, so that it may learn to love God for God alone, not for reward, not for relief, but for truth. The dark night is not despair. It is purification. It is the fire that burns away every lesser attachment, so that the soul may stand naked before the infinite and say, "Even now, I choose you." The Buddha, too, spoke not of avoiding suffering, but of understanding it. He saw suffering as universal, but not final. He taught that pain arises from attachment, from craving, from clinging to that which changes. And so, the way forward is not resistance, but release. The middle way, a path between indulgence and denial, offers not the end of affliction, but the transformation of its meaning. Suffering becomes a teacher when it is no longer a punishment, but a message. And liberation is not escape from the world, but awakening within it. Allan Kardec, speaking through the voice of Spiritism, echoed a similar truth, that trials and expiations are not marks of divine cruelty, but opportunities for growth, chosen sometimes even before birth. The soul, in its higher awareness, sees what the ego cannot. That pain, when faced with courage and love, refines character, dissolves pride, deepens empathy. That those who suffer are not cursed, but called. To suffer consciously is not simply to endure. It is to cooperate with the unfolding of a deeper wisdom, to allow what wounds us to also shape us. Not all pain is noble, but all pain can be redeemed when it is met with presence, with humility, with love. The soul learns not in theory, but in experience. An experience, especially when marked by affliction, leaves impressions that no book or teacher can replicate. The trembling of the heart when all illusions are gone. The silence that falls when no prayer seems to be answered. The grief that opens like a door, revealing a world more raw, more sacred, more real than the one we thought we knew. These moments are not detours. They are initiations. Affliction reveals what is shallow and what is true. It shows us the fragility of the masks we wear and the depth of the self we hide. It teaches compassion, not as sentiment, but as recognition, that others bleed as we do, that no one escapes the curriculum of the soul. We become gentler not by avoiding pain, but by letting it break us open. In this breaking, the ego shatters. The roles fall away. What remains is the essence, the soul no longer seeking applause or certainty, but simply truth. A truth that has no name, but whose presence is unmistakable. It lives in surrender, in stillness, in the quiet strength of one who has been refined by fire and still chooses to love. Teilhard's evolutionary flame burns here, in the soul's willingness to rise through suffering rather than be crushed by it, in its capacity to see affliction not as failure, but as part of the spiral toward light. Evolution is not only external, it is internal, and every dark night, every unanswered question, every heartbreak can become fuel for ascent if we let it. St. John of the Cross knew this. His darkness was not an end, but a passage. The soul, stripped of all external comfort, finds God not outside, but within, in the absence, in a longing, in the unknowing that becomes its own kind of faith. A faith that needs no proof because it has walked through fire and found that even there, God remains. The Buddha, too, reminds us that liberation does not come from changing what is outside, but from changing how we relate to what is. The middle way is not a compromise. It is a transcendence, a life lived in harmony with what is real, even when it hurts. In this space, the soul ceases to resist and begins to see suffering not as enemy, but as mirror, as guide, as friend. And Allan Kardec's spirit teachings affirm this journey, that the hardest lives are sometimes chosen by the bravest souls. That affliction, when met with grace, becomes a ladder. That every loss contains a hidden offering. That justice is not always seen with mortal eyes, but is written in the arc of many lives. In this light, suffering becomes sacred, not because it is good, but because it can lead to good, because it can awaken, because it can transmute, because it can bring us back to the truth of who we are, eternal, luminous in process. The soul is not crushed by pain, it is shaped by it, and the shape it takes is not of despair, but of devotion, not of bitterness, but of becoming. As we continue this journey, we leave behind the fires of affliction and enter the quiet presence of those who have passed through them, the mystics, the seers, the lovers of God, who turn suffering into song and longing into light. There are souls who do not flee the fire, who step into it willingly, not to be consumed, but to be made holy. They are not stronger than others, nor immune to pain, but they have learned something the world often forgets, that suffering, when offered without resistance, becomes a flame that does not destroy, it purifies. Mystics do not speak about God as an idea. They speak to God, from God, through God. Their words burn because they have walked through the furnace of human limitation and emerged not with answers, but with presence, the kind of presence that makes silence feel full and wounds feel sacred. To them, suffering is not punishment. It is invitation, a threshold, a veil so thin it burns when touched. Pain is not the enemy of union, it is often its herald. Rumi, the poet of longing and divine intoxication, wrote that the wound is the place where the light enters you. He did not romanticize pain, but he refused to waste it. His verses were born of exile, of grief, of ecstatic loss. For him, the tearing open of the heart was not tragedy, it was initiation. The beloved hides in the ache, and only when all else falls away does the soul become spacious enough to receive the fullness of love. Saint Teresa of Avila knew this fire intimately. In her visions, pain and ecstasy danced as one. She wrote of the transfiguration, the piercing of the heart by a divine arrow, both agonizing and sweet. For her, union with God was not an escape from suffering, but a surrender to it so complete that the soul became translucent. The more it bled, the more it radiated. The more it relinquished, the more it was filled. Ecstasy, she taught, is born from letting go of all we think we are until only the beloved remains. Meister Eckhart, the silent thunder of German mysticism, spoke not of visions, but of emptiness. For him, suffering was the soul's unraveling from all that is not God. Detachment was not coldness. It was the freedom to let all things be what they are. In suffering, the ego loosens. The demands cease. And what remains is surrender, a holy unknowing where God is not grasped but yielded to, not possessed but lived through. The soul that lets go of all things, he said, finds all things in God. This path is not dramatic. Often it is hidden, quiet, unseen. Saint Therese of Lisieux called it the little way, a path not of grand gestures, but of love offered in the smallest moments, especially when they cost us everything. Her suffering was physical, emotional, invisible, and yet she offered it like a flower, trusting that in God's hands, even the smallest act done with great love could move the heavens. She did not seek the fire. She let herself be consumed by it gently, daily, tenderly. Her holiness was not in avoiding pain, but in sanctifying it with love. The mystics remind us that the fire of suffering is not to be feared. It is to be entered with trust, not because it will not burn, but because what it burns away is not who we are. It is what hides who we are, the illusions, the clinging, the masks. In the Zohar, the great mystical text of Judaism, suffering is seen not as mere consequence, but as a portal, a tool for cosmic repair. It is not meaningless. It is redemptive. Through affliction, sparks of divine light, once scattered, are gathered back into wholeness. Every sorrow becomes a thread in the great tikkun, the mending of the broken vessels of creation. In this view, suffering is not individual. It is cosmic, and our response to it becomes a sacred participation in the healing of the world. Mystics do not ask to be spared from pain. They ask to be made whole through it. In their prayers, we do not find bargains, but surrender. Not escape, but immersion. They trust the fire because they have seen what lies on the other side. Not comfort, but communion. Not perfection, but presence. The fire does not erase the soul. It reveals it. When Rumi speaks of longing, he does not speak of lack. He speaks of the soul stretching, reaching towards something it already knows but has forgotten. Suffering sharpens that longing, transforms it from ache to song. It is in this paradox that the mystic lives, that the more the heart breaks, the wider it becomes. That pain, when embraced, becomes not a chain, but a wing. Saint Therese's ecstasies were not apart from her struggles. Her visions came through years of illness, rejection, doubt. Her union with the divine was forged not in some elevated detachment, but in the flesh and blood reality of being misunderstood, silenced, and unwell. And yet she danced. In her writings, one hears the laughter of one who has tasted eternity, not because her pain vanished, but because it was transfigured into gold. Meister Eckhart's silence is no less powerful. He teaches that God is not found in what we cling to, but in what we release. His detachment is not coldness, but spaciousness. A soul emptied of ego becomes a vessel through which the infinite can pour itself. This is the fire of transformation. It does not decorate the self, it dissolves it. And in the dissolution, the soul meets the one who has never left. Therese, walking her little way, offers us a mysticism not of visions, but of simplicity. Her fire was quiet. Her surrender was daily. In the offering of her small discomforts, her hidden tears, her invisible sacrifices, she created a pathway for those who would never wear robes or enter monasteries, but who suffer just the same. She teaches that love sanctifies everything, even, especially, what the world calls insignificant. For God sees not the size of the act, but the size of the heart that offers it. And in the luminous threads of the Zohar, we find again the truth that suffering is not separate from the divine mystery. It is woven into it. Every wound holds a spark, every sorrow a fragment of forgotten light. And when the soul holds its pain with reverence, with patience, with trust, that light is released, not only for the self, but for the whole. The mystic becomes not just a seeker of union, but a channel for restoration. The pain endured becomes prayer. The love born from it becomes offering. This is the alchemy of suffering in the mystical path. It does not merely teach. It transforms. It turns flesh into flame, ego into offering, longing into light. And in that light, the soul remembers what it has always been, not broken but burning, not forsaken but found. The mystics do not promise us comfort. They promise us depth, not a life without pain, but a life where pain becomes doorway and fire becomes home. As we continue, we leave behind the solitude of mystics and step once more into the collective to examine not only what suffering does within us, but how it unites us, how it opens us to the other, and how, in the mirror of another's pain, we find the call to become fully human. There are wounds older than time, wounds that were not born in bodies, but in the very fabric of the universe. Long before a child cried in a cradle, before the first betrayal between friends, before death entered language, there was another fall, not of man, but of angels. Not from Eden, but from the luminous halls of spiritual governance where freedom was given, and with it, the power to fracture love itself. According to the Urantia Book, this fracture is not myth, but memory, a memory etched into the energy of our world, still pulsing beneath the surface of history. The rebellion of Lucifer, once a brilliant administrator of systems, was not a violent war, but a defiant assertion. That divine authority could be replaced with self-rule, that the harmony of the universe could be improved by severing it from its source. It was rebellion wrapped in philosophy, a choice not to destroy love, but to redefine it, without accountability, without obedience, without origin. Lucifer was not alone. He was joined by others, including Caligastia, the planetary prince of Earth, one entrusted to guide our world toward light and integration, but who chose instead to betray the trust given him. And with that betrayal came the fall, not into flames, but into separation. A separation so complete that Earth was cast into spiritual quarantine, cut off from the circuits of communication that connect evolving worlds with the higher realms of truth, beauty, and guidance. This is the cosmic sorrow we are born into, not because we are guilty, but because we are part of the story. We live in a world that inherited the silence of that rebellion, the dissonance of that choice. A planet that walks in partial light, where spiritual confusion lingers in the atmosphere, and love must struggle through thorns to reach the sun. In this view, suffering is not simply the product of psychological wounds or ethical failures. It is the echo of a cosmic fracture, a dislodging of divine order that left ripples through systems and souls alike. We do not suffer merely because we are flawed. We suffer because we were born into a narrative of rupture, where truth is obscured and trust must be rebuilt from the dust. And yet, even in this cosmic breach, something was never lost. The Father did not abandon. The Source did not withdraw. A plan was born, not of vengeance, but of restoration. According to the same revelation, the mission of Jesus, Michael of Nebadon incarnate, was not only to teach love and mercy to humanity, but to repair the rift. He came not only to redeem individuals, but to reaffirm the reality of divine government, to reestablish the Father's will on a planet that had forgotten its origin. He entered the very heart of the confusion, walked the soil of rebellion, and planted within it the seed of restored alignment. He did not come with swords. He came with silence, with service, with surrender. He did not argue with the fallen logic of rebellion. He embodied its opposite. He healed by being what the fracture had denied: pure obedience, radiant compassion, fearless union with the source. And in doing so, he opened a new path, not only to heaven, but back to wholeness. The fall, then, is not only a moment in celestial history. It is a condition within us, a forgetting that repeats itself in small ways, in every act of self-centeredness, in every refusal to forgive, in every denial of our divine origin. The cosmic rebellion is not far from us. It echoes in the ego's hunger for power, in the mind's insistence on control, in the heart's fear of surrender. Gnostic thought echoes this beautifully. It tells of Sophia, divine wisdom, who, in longing to know the unknowable, descends from the pleroma into the lower realms, giving rise to a flawed creation where the divine spark becomes hidden in matter. It is not a fall into evil, but into separation, into a world of forgetfulness, where the soul wanders in search of what it has always been. The Gnostic path is not one of escape, but of remembrance. To awaken is to reclaim the light buried beneath form, to gather the scattered pieces of the divine within us and around us, and to walk the way of return. In this light, suffering becomes a kind of homesickness, a pain not of punishment, but of distance, not a sign that we are broken, but that we remember wholeness. The anguish we carry is, in part, the echo of our own exile, the cry of the soul for what it once knew but can no longer name. And yet, even this cry is sacred, for to cry out is to turn again toward the source. The Christian esoteric tradition speaks of redemption not as a legal transaction, but as a cosmic rebalancing, the lifting of a world back into resonance with the divine. Christ is seen not only as Savior, but as Logos, the living pattern that heals fragmentation. Through him, the path of descent is reversed. Through him, love becomes the thread that rewinds the fall. He did not simply come to forgive sin, but to illuminate our true identity, to show us not only what God is, but what we are: sons and daughters of the Most High, bearers of light, agents of restoration. In him, the fracture is not erased, but transformed. The wound becomes the womb of new creation. The Urantia Book affirms this vision, that the bestowal of Christ Michael on this world was not only a mercy, but a revelation, that his life was not lived to impress heaven, but to illuminate earth, that he became flesh not to condemn, but to reveal the face of the Father in the suffering of the child, the confusion of the seeker, the betrayal of the friend, the silence of the tomb. And in his resurrection, something shifted, not only in theology, but in the spiritual structure of this planet. A new circuit was opened. A new path was cleared. The quarantine, though not instantly lifted, was pierced by light. The fall, though ancient, was no longer final. We, the inhabitants of this fractured world, now carry within us both the memory of the rebellion and the possibility of restoration, the wound and the key, the exile and the homecoming. And every act of love, every conscious choice, every moment of forgiveness becomes a stitch in the fabric of healing. Not just personal healing, but cosmic. For the fracture of love can only be healed by love, not abstractly, but through living it, in silence, in service, in sacrifice. And so we become, like Christ, bearers of repair. The rebellion still echoes, but so does the answer. And every soul that remembers who they are becomes a spark in the fire of restoration. a quiet rebellion in reverse, a turning back to the light that never left. As we move forward, we descend from the heavens and return to the human, to explore how this pain, once transformed, becomes the bridge between souls. How suffering, when shared, does not divide, it unites. And in the presence of the other, the next chapter of healing begins. We are never truly alone in our pain. Even when the room is silent, when no hand reaches out, when the sorrow feels singular, there remains something, someone, that echoes within us. The presence of the other is not only external. It lives in memory, in possibility, in the sacred ache to be seen. Suffering, when hidden, isolates, but when revealed, it binds. Not in chains, but in recognition. There is a language beneath language, a knowing beneath names, and suffering speaks it fluently. It tells us again and again that what wounds one touches all. In the teachings of the Buddha, this is interbeing, the understanding that nothing exists in isolation. My sorrow is not mine alone, because there is no separate I. We are threads in a single garment, leaves on one tree. The pain I feel in solitude is part of the great sea of sorrow that flows through all living things. And when I see your pain, I do not merely observe it. I remember my own. I recognize it, and that recognition becomes compassion. But compassion is not pity. It is not a soft indulgence or a distant sympathy. It is the sacred act of standing near another's suffering without needing to fix it. It is presence without control, witness without solution. It is love in its purest form, a love that does not escape pain, but sits beside it and says, I am here too. This is the love Jesus spoke of when he told the story of the Samaritan, a man who, by cultural standards, should have passed by the broken body on the road. Yet something within him refused to look away. He crossed the line of indifference. He entered the suffering of a stranger and called it his own. The parable does not celebrate doctrine, status, or even prayer. It celebrates response. The refusal to remain untouched by another's pain. Martin Buber saw this as the foundation of true relationship. To meet another not as object, but as presence, I and thou. Not you as a category or role, but thou as sacred being. In that meeting, something more than empathy occurs. There is a communion, a moment when the veil thins, and we remember that the divine does not dwell in temples or clouds, but in the eyes of the other, the hungry, the weeping, the forgotten. In every face a mirror, in every mirror God. But this connection is not automatic. It requires something costly, vulnerability, the willingness to let our armor crack, to be seen in our weakness, our confusion, our longing. Brené Brown calls this the birthplace of empathy, not strength as performance, but courage as openness. It is in vulnerability that we become real. And in becoming real, we become reachable. To be vulnerable is not to collapse. It is to choose authenticity over protection. It is to say, this is my pain, and I trust you enough to let you see it. It is to live unguarded, knowing full well that this openness might bring more pain, but it is the only path that leads to love. The gospel whispers the same truth. Weep with those who weep. Not analyze, not minimize, not explain. Weep, enter in, share the weight. Let your own heart tremble in the face of theirs. There's a kind of awakening that cannot be achieved alone. It happens when the boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve, when suffering becomes shared, and in that sharing, softened. We're not healed by isolation. We are healed by connection, by the gaze that says, I see you, by the hand that doesn't pull us out, but holds us until we rise. And if it is true that we suffer alone, it is more deeply true that we awaken together. The shared experience of pain dissolves the illusion of separation faster than any ideology, any system, any sermon. In a world fractured by difference, suffering remains one of the last languages we all understand. The moment we see ourselves in the other, and the other in ourselves, the walls begin to fall. We begin to realize that compassion is not an act of charity. It is an act of honesty, of alignment, of remembering that we are not separate bodies floating through space, but one soul experiencing itself in countless forms. Empathy is not weakness. It is the fierce commitment to unity in a world that thrives on division. It says, I will not close my heart just because it hurts to keep it open. It says, I will stay, I will listen, I will feel this with you because what happens to you happens to me. In this way, suffering is not only personal, it becomes relational, and through relationship, transformational. This is the silent revolution of presence, the sacred activism of simply being with, of bearing witness, of holding pain without the compulsion to erase it. And it is in this holy space that healing begins, not always as cure, but as connection. The collective begins to stir when enough individuals choose to feel, not to be overwhelmed by the suffering of the world, but to respond to it with open hands and willing hearts. Awakening is not merely a private ascent. It is the rising of many who look into the mirror of the other and say, I cannot be whole while you are unseen. I cannot be free while you're still bound. And in this rising, we begin to change what suffering means. It becomes less about endurance, more about communion, less about isolation, more about interdependence. The story shifts from me to we, from despair to solidarity, from silence to shared song. The mystics knew this. The prophets felt it. The poets sang of it, that when one heart breaks, the sky itself listens. That to hold another sorrow is to participate in the mending of the world. Weeping with those who weep is not only a spiritual directive, it is a doorway, a passage from individual identity into shared divinity, a remembering that love is not a feeling, but a choice. And empathy is how love moves through pain without losing itself. As we carry these truths forward, the journey continues deeper into the life of one who embodied them all, the one who did not watch from afar, but entered the wound of the world, touched its lepers, broke its bread, wept with its mourners, and gave his own tears as offering. The one who showed that to love is to suffer with, and to suffer with is to save. If suffering reveals character, then in Jesus it revealed something more, the nature of God. For in him, pain did not diminish the divine. It expressed it. His wounds did not hide glory. They became its signature. There's a kind of strength that shouts, and another that kneels. A kind of power that dominates, and one that chooses to be pierced. In Jesus, we see not the glory of conquest, but the grandeur of surrender, the dignity of one who enters the darkest chamber of human experience and calls it holy ground. According to the Urantia Book, the life of Jesus, Christ Michael incarnate, was not only a revelation to this world, but to the universe. His suffering was not a failure of mission, but the mission itself. He came not to escape pain, but to embrace it, to walk into the brokenness of a quarantined planet and shine the light of unbroken love. Every step he took, from the cradle to the cross, was a declaration. This is what the Father looks like. Not a God of wrath, but of weeping. Not a throne of distance, but a heart that bends low. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we see this heart trembling. Jesus, kneeling in olive-scented silence, does not float above agony. He enters it fully. He asks for the cup to pass, not because he doubts, but because he is real. His divinity does not cancel his humanity, it deepens it. And in that moment, when sweat becomes blood, when friends fall asleep and heaven seems quiet, we see the cost of love, to carry the world's pain with open hands and not turn away. On the cross, this love reaches its crescendo, not in thunder, but in forgiveness. He does not curse his killers. He speaks to them. They know not what they do. He sees past their violence into their blindness, past the nails into the souls. His suffering does not close him, it opens him wider. And from that opening flows not only redemption, but revelation. Teilhard de Chardin would call this the Christic axis, the vertical flame upon which the evolution of consciousness turns. For him, Christ is not only historical, but cosmic, the divine presence in all becoming. The cross is not just wood and blood, but a mystical symbol of union, the intersection of matter and spirit, time and eternity, suffering and love. In Jesus, pain becomes radiant, not glorified as good, but transfigured into gift. A gift that continues to burn across centuries, not as memory, but as invitation. To imitate Christ, as Thomas à Kempis wrote, is not merely to repeat his actions, but to enter his heart, to feel as he felt, to forgive as he forgave, to love when unloved. His path is not one of escape, but of embodiment. It is the descent into humility, into service, into the kind of silence that holds the scream without breaking. It is to find joy not in avoiding pain, but in being faithful through it. The Franciscan vision sees this clearly. For them, joy does not wait for suffering to end. It lives within it, not as denial, but as a deeper seeing. St. Francis, in his ragged robes and radiant eyes, understood what Jesus revealed, that when all is lost, love remains. And where love remains, joy flowers. Even in crucified soil, if suffering is the wound of humanity, then in Jesus it becomes the doorway to divinity. His pain does not end with death, it transforms death. The tomb, cold and sealed by human hands, becomes the site of cosmic reversal. And yet, even in resurrection, the wounds remain. The risen Christ still bears the scars, not as symbols of defeat, but as emblems of love that would rather be broken than break another. In him, suffering is not erased, it is sanctified. The Urantia Book speaks of Jesus not only as Son of God, but as the full revelation of the Father's heart. His suffering was not compensation for human sin, but a divine demonstration. This is who I am, even in the darkest hour. There is no need to suffer to prove worthiness, but in choosing to suffer with, he revealed the worthiness of every soul. The pain he bore was not punishment, it was participation. It was intimacy. It was incarnation in its fullest sense. Teilhard de Chardin's vision of the cosmic Christ widens this mystery. For Teilhard, Christ is the magnetic center toward which all evolution converges, not only biologically but spiritually. And at the heart of that convergence is love tested through suffering. Jesus does not stand above the world, but pulses within it, inviting every sorrow into communion, every wound into transformation. His crucifixion becomes a universal archetype, the death of the ego, the resurrection of the soul, the fusion of the finite with the eternal. To suffer with Jesus, then, is not merely to imitate a martyr. It is to awaken the Christ within. It is to carry one's own cross not in despair, but in dignity. Not in silence of defeat, but in silence of resolve. It is to walk through life not untouched by grief, but unbroken by it. to forgive even when justice is denied, to serve even when unseen, to love even when unloved, and in this, to mirror the divine. This is what Thomas à Kempis longed for, the soul molded in hidden places by the pressure of divine fire. Not a religion of comfort, but of courage. Not a faith of prosperity, but of presence. A knowing that when the soul passes through its Gethsemane, it is never alone. For the Christ who prayed in the garden, who bled on the cross, and who breathed peace in the upper room, is the same Christ who now walks beside every suffering heart. The Franciscan path invites us to find joy here, not after pain, but through it. St. Francis sang, not because the world was gentle, but because love had made him so. Joy was not the absence of suffering, but the fullness of surrender. And in that surrender, the dignity of Christ is born again in those who dare to live as he lived. Open, vulnerable, faithful, and radiant. Jesus dignified suffering not by avoiding it, but by walking through it with eyes wide open. He did not glorify pain, but infused it with purpose. He did not demand escape, but offered embrace. And in that embrace, all who suffer find a place, not on the margins, but at the center of the sacred. And so we move forward bearing this light, not to escape suffering, but to sanctify it, not to idolize pain, but to honor its power to reveal love. For in the wounded Christ, we find not only God with us, but God as us, walking, weeping, healing, and rising. Pain knocks at the door without warning, sometimes softly, like an old memory, sometimes violently, like the collapse of everything once held sacred. It comes dressed in loss, in illness, in rejection, in silence. And when it comes, it asks one question, not why, but who. Who will you become through this? The human impulse is to resist it, to numb it, to blame or escape. Yet the deeper path is not outward, but inward. Not denial, but presence. Suffering only becomes suffering when we identify with it, when we fuse our being to our pain and say, this is me. But that is illusion. Pain is not identity, it is invitation. An invitation to become conscious. Eckhart Tolle calls this the awakening of the pain body, the dense field of emotional residue we carry, which feeds on reactivity and unconsciousness. When we are unaware, we live as victims of this internal force. But when we observe it, feel it without becoming it, we reclaim the seat of awareness. In the stillness of now, the pain body loses its grip. The story softens. The wound begins to breathe. And what seemed like suffering becomes space. This is not spiritual bypassing. It is not pretending that pain is unreal. It is realizing that beneath the pain, something is more real still. The light that sees, the presence that remains unshaken. The goal is not to eliminate all hardship. It is to live in such a way that hardship no longer owns us. That we feel everything without becoming trapped by anything. That we bleed, yes, but consciously, lovingly, awake. Marianne Williamson writes that miracles occur as shifts in perception, from fear to love, from guilt to grace. And suffering, in her vision, is not punishment but misalignment. When we return to love, even through tears, we begin to see clearly. Pain is not the enemy. It is the alarm, the teacher, the threshold between the false and the true. Eastern spirituality teaches this through silence, the art of watching without grasping. In Buddhism, non-identification is freedom. In the Upanishads, the self is described as untouched by joy or sorrow, like the sun, which remains luminous regardless of clouds. To transcend pain is not to flee from it, but to stop clinging to it, to let it pass through like wind through an open window, to let it teach but not define. Spiritual practices become the vessels of this transcendence. Meditation slows the mind enough to witness the self behind the story. Prayer reorients the soul toward the sacred. Silence clears the static so that truth may whisper again. And gratitude, radical gratitude, breaks the spell of lack and reminds us that even in the dark, beauty still pulses. Victory, then, is not the absence of pain. It is the transformation of our posture toward it, from clenched fists to open palms, from resistance to reverence. We no longer say, "Why me?" But what now? Now what have I lost? But what can I give from this place? And in that giving, we rise, not in spite of our wounds, but because of them. Transcendence is not a mountain peak to be reached, but a surrendering into what already is. It is not a new identity, but the soft release of the false one. Pain, once seen with the eyes of spirit, becomes a guidepost, not a jailer. And through it, we discover that victory was never about escaping the wound. It was about becoming whole within it. This is the turning point of all spiritual paths, when the soul no longer asks the world to change, but changes the way it meets the world. In that reversal, victimhood dissolves like mist before the morning sun. The narrative of powerlessness collapses, and what remains is agency, the sacred agency of choice. To choose presence instead of panic, to choose gentleness instead of judgment, to choose love even when the heart still trembles. The great mystics and teachers did not transcend suffering by denying its reality, but by transforming their relationship to it. They welcomed it as a sacred flame that burns away illusion. They bowed before it as one bows before a master sculptor, knowing that to be shaped by suffering is to be revealed. The true face of the soul shines not after the storm, but because it stood in the rain and did not run. Gratitude becomes the hidden key, not shallow thanks for what is pleasant, but deep reverence for what awakens. To be grateful for the wound that taught us humility, for the darkness that taught us how to seek the light, for the silence that taught us to listen again. In this sacred perspective, suffering becomes sacred ground. And from this ground, we walk differently. We speak with softness. We hold others with more care. We cry without shame and celebrate without pride. Our lives become altars, not because they are perfect, but because they are honest. We carry the quiet wisdom of those who have suffered and survived and loved anyway. Victory is not loud. It is not parade. It does not conquer in the traditional sense. It stands quietly in the center of the storm and says, "I am still here. I have become more than the pain that tried to undo me. I have remembered who I am." And so we arrive, not at an end, but at a beginning, a deeper way of being, a freer way of loving, a more luminous way of seeing. The pain has not disappeared, but its chains have broken. And from its ashes, the soul rises, not as a victim, but as a living flame. There is a moment, suspended between breath and silence, where pain ceases to be agony and begins to become offering. That moment is the cross, not only the wooden beam on which a man once hung, but the eternal symbol carved into the fabric of human consciousness, where the vertical of the divine meets the horizontal of human experience. The cross is not merely an instrument of death. It is the crucible of rebirth. It holds in its arms the paradox that pain, when transmuted, becomes light. In the Urantia revelation, the cross of Jesus is not a debt paid to appease wrath, but the ultimate expression of unyielding love. His agony was not demanded, it was chosen, freely, consciously, lovingly. It became the supreme act of solidarity with all who suffer, a silent cry that whispered across the cosmos, "You are not alone." Even God knows what it means to bleed. The cross, then, is not an end, it is a portal. Carl Jung saw in the cross a universal archetype, the intersection of opposites, the integration of light and shadow, the place where the ego dies so the self may live. In the crucifixion, he discerned not just a theological drama, but a psychological necessity. To evolve, the soul must descend, must be pierced by its contradictions, must hang between what it was and what it is becoming. Only through this sacred tension does true integration arise. The alchemists knew this. They called it solve et coagula, dissolve and rejoin. First, the burning, the dismemberment, the loss. Then, from the ashes, the recomposition, a new being, forged not in ease but in fire. This is the alchemy of the cross, to pass through pain not to escape it, but to be made luminous by it. Suffering does not have to make us bitter. It can make us true. And so we return to the words of the Nazarene. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. What is buried in pain may rise in purpose. What is broken may become blessing. What is crucified in silence may resurrect in glory. The mystery is not in avoiding the cross, but in embracing it with the knowing that it does not have the final word. The mystics understood this deeply. For them, suffering was not merely endured, it was espoused. Teresa, John of the Cross, and countless others spoke of the soul's bridal union with God through the path of affliction. The soul does not meet God in comfort. It meets him in surrender. When all else is stripped away and nothing remains but the ache, the silence, and the flame, it is then that the divine draws near. And in that intimate agony, the soul learns to say, "Not my will, but yours." To carry the cross, then, is not a punishment. It is an invitation. To be stretched, yes. To be broken, perhaps. But above all, to be made whole. Pain, when walked with love, becomes the forge in which the soul is crowned. In this way, even death is not defeat. It is transfiguration. It is here, in the crucible of paradox, that meaning is not explained but revealed. For those who gaze long enough upon the cross, not just with eyes but with the heart, something begins to shift. It is no longer just a moment in history, nor merely a religious image. It becomes a mirror, a message, a mystery. It speaks not only of Jesus, but of us all. Of every wound we've carried, every sacrifice made in silence, every grief endured in secret, every night we laid ourselves down on our own invisible crosses and chose to love anyway. The alchemical truth is that gold does not emerge from comfort. It is born from fire. And so too, the soul, when it has been tested in sorrow, emerges radiant. Not untouched by pain, but transfigured through it. The true miracle is not the removal of suffering, but the resurrection that rises from its ashes. The cross is the gate through which death becomes doorway and despair becomes devotion. In this, the Urantia Book offers a profound illumination that Jesus' death was not demanded by God, but freely embraced as a revelation of divine love. It was not a transaction to satisfy wrath, but an outpouring to awaken hearts. On the cross, he showed us the full measure of a life surrendered to love, even unto death. And by doing so, he redefined both love and death forever. In the stillness that follows the agony, a deeper song begins to rise, not sung with the mouth, but with the soul. It is the music of those who have descended and returned, bearing light. It is the voice of the risen, the forgiven, the awakened. It is the sound of pain transmuted into compassion, of sacrifice blooming into grace. This is the alchemy of the cross, that the greatest wound becomes the greatest wellspring. To walk this path is not to glorify suffering, but to sanctify it, to see it not as punishment, but as potential, to know that in the divine economy, nothing is wasted. Every tear sown becomes a seed of light. Every loss carries the imprint of redemption. Every crucifixion carries the whisper of resurrection. And so we end, not in despair, but in fire, not broken, but opened, not as victims, but as vessels of wisdom, of tenderness of God. The cross has done its work. It has not crushed us. It has crowned us. In the quiet aftermath of questioning, after the flame has passed through the temple and the soul has stood, trembling, at the edge of all it once believed, something gentle descends. Not a solution, not a doctrine, but a presence, a warmth in the hollow, a whisper in the silence. We have traversed the landscape of suffering, not to escape it, but to see it, to touch its edges with reverence and not recoil, to name it without fear, and in naming it, to find that we are not alone. Pain does not become holy by being explained. It becomes holy when it is held with love. That love, vast and beyond comprehension, pulses beneath the surface of everything. It is the divine thread woven through the chaos, the steady flame in the dark garden of Gethsemane, the voice that calls us not to understand everything, but to trust enough to take the next step. The soul that has walked through sorrow and returned intact, or even shattered but willing, is no longer the same. Something essential has changed. The old armor has cracked. The illusion of control has dissolved. And what remains is softer, wiser, and infinitely more human. This, perhaps, is the secret no philosopher, no prophet, no mystic could ever fully capture. That to suffer is to be invited into intimacy with the sacred. In the fires of loss, the soul remembers its belonging. In the ache of longing, it hears the echo of its source. In the absence, it discovers presence. It is this alchemy, not the removal of suffering, but the transfiguration of it, that becomes the hidden curriculum of life. We are not here to avoid pain. We are here to be changed by it. The Book of Urantia tells us that we live in a universe designed by love and governed by purpose. Even the tragedies of rebellion and separation are woven into a greater arc of restoration. We are pilgrims in time, yes, but also children of eternity. Our suffering is not the final word. The final word is always love. There will still be days when the questions return, when the silence feels unbearable and the ache too deep to name. There will still be moments of shadow, still wounds that reopen. But now, we walk with eyes that have seen the light hidden beneath the veil. We carry a knowing, not the kind that solves, but the kind that soothes. A knowing that suffering is not the opposite of life, but one of its sacred languages. The mystics knew this. The sages and the poets, too. They left us fragments like breadcrumbs in the dark, verses and visions, prayers and tears, each one pointing back to a central truth, that we are never abandoned in our pain. Even when God is silent, God is not absent. Even when heaven is hidden, it is not gone. The divine bends low, not above us, but within us, inhabiting our most human ache with the fire of redemption. The cross, the night, the shadow, all these are thresholds, not walls, not dead ends. They mark the beginning of something truer than certainty, the emergence of a soul refined, realigned, and reawakened. A soul no longer searching for explanations, but breathing with compassion. A soul that no longer fears pain because it has passed through it and discovered life on the other side. This is the true transcendence, not to float above suffering, but to descend into it so deeply that we rise bearing light. We become healers not because we have avoided pain, but because we have befriended it. We become witnesses of the sacred not through escape, but through surrender. We become vessels of meaning not because we have all the answers, but because we dared to keep our hearts open in the dark. So now, beloved soul, as you leave this sacred dialogue, take with you not the weight of doctrine, but the warmth of remembrance. You are part of a story greater than your wounds. You are the living evidence that even brokenness can bloom. You are the voice, the breath, the song of a love that never leaves. And when the night falls again, as it surely will, may you walk into it not as a victim, but as a torchbearer, with your pain transfigured into purpose, with your tears consecrated into healing waters, with your story becoming someone else's compass. This is the alchemy. This is the mystery. This is the hope. And so, we return to where we began, not unchanged, but reborn. And if you enjoyed this content, please comment where you're from, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel. It's very important and help us in many ways. Every day we bring new videos to nourish the soul.